Muy buenas, ya ha comenzado la rueda de prensa de la presidenta de la Comisión Europea, Ursula von der Leyen, así que conectamos ya para ver cómo presenta von der Leyen ese plan, ese Green Deal para contrarrestar los efectos de la Ley de Reducción de Inflación en Estados Unidos.
Good news. We have since long argued that the fight against climate change is a must for our planet, a must for our economic prosperity, and a must for our strategic independence. We are competitive. We need competition. What we are looking at is that we have a level playing field in the global competition as well as a level playing field within the single market. This is for us so important. Therefore, what are our next steps? The communication that we present today has 4 pillars. First of all, a conducive regulatory environment for the net zero industries. Second, national and EU funding. Third, the ensuring of proper skills for the green transition. And an ambitious trade agenda is the 4th pillar. Let me have a look at the first pillar. We all know that to grow, our net zero industries need the right framework. It has to be simpler, it has to be faster, and it has to be more predictable. We will therefore propose the Net Zero Industry Act. It will focus on the key technologies for the shift to net zero. It will speed up permitting. This is one of the major complaints when you speak to the business, the net zero industry. The major complaint is always the permitting processes. And it will incentivize multi-country projects. A big focus is on cutting red tape. And it will set targets for what we need till 2030, because there's a simple equation: only what gets measured gets done. We know that we need to secure the volumes needed for raw materials. For that, we will propose a Critical Raw Materials Act. Its aim is to facilitate the extracting, the processing, but also the recycling in the European Union, and of course, the search for substitutes. Then energy, as explained, is in particular, alongside the raw materials, energy and electricity, the other core element our industry requires to be competitive on. So we will come forward also in March with the electricity market design, because electricity users should be able to benefit from the low costs of renewables. This is the first pillar, the regulatory environment. The second pillar is the funding. And here we have at national level one instrument that is well known, that is state aid, to promote investment in strategic sectors. We all know that the European Union has already a temporary crisis framework in place since the beginning of Russia's war in Ukraine. We will further adapt it now to the net zero industry requirements, and important is it has to be targeted, this adaptation, and it has to be time limited. Margrethe Vestager will, after this press conference, present the changes or the adaptation for a public consultation that starts today in state aid. Very important, if we look at state aid, we must be careful and avoid any kind of fragmentation of the single market. So the level playing field for the single market internally is as important as the level playing field we want globally. And therefore, for me, always, if you have state aid, the other side of the coin has to be funding at the EU level. We need this first step of funding now, so we cannot wait too long. We need a bridging solution to later other financing instruments, but at the moment being, we need to work with what we have right now and focus it on the clean tech industry. This means we want to leverage the possibilities provided by Repower EU, by Invest EU, and by the Innovation Fund. You recall that I said Repower EU has been proposed by us in May last year. It took quite a while till it was agreed. Now it's up and running, it's ready to go. And we initially proposed it to get rid of the dependency of Russian fossil fuels. And initially we were discussing whether we are able to do that till 2027 or earlier. Well, you know now that we have gotten rid of our dependency completely of Russian fossil fuels. It went much faster than we expected. That's good so. So we have the possibility to redirect or reorient the additional funding of REPowerEU, it's about 250 billion euros, to our net zero industries. For this, we will enable and encourage the member states to use the money from REPowerEU, for example, for tax breaks to the net zero industry, because this mirrors then the speed, the predictability, and the targeted way forward, as we see, for example, from competitors. It's fast, it's predictable, it is targeted. The second element in this ready-to-go or available funds is InvestEU. We will assess how funding could be increased. InvestEU has a different approach. REPowerEU goes to member states with a view on the net zero industry. InvestEU looks at projects. It catalyzes private investment through guarantees to the EIB and the national promotional banks. In other words, it eases the access to funding at crucial moments of new product developments for innovative projects, for pioneering companies, for state-of-the-art industries. So this is more looking at the company or the project level. And the third element, also looking at projects, is the Innovation Fund, which will work with production subsidies for key technologies. As I said, this is the bridging we need right now for a midterm solution in the context of the review of the MFF, when we will propose to set up a European Sovereignty Fund. This European Sovereignty Fund is targeted at boosting resources available for upstream research, for innovation, and for strategic industrial projects. And this is the main element that we're looking at, but it takes more time to develop it. That was the funding. The second pillar, the third pillar is skills. We will only be successful in having a prosperous net zero industry here in the European Union if there are enough skilled personnel, And you know that already today, companies are desperately looking for personnel. I'm not only speaking about skilled personnel, but also just personnel. Nearly 30% of businesses in the manufacturing electrical equipment, for example, say that they face labor shortages right now already. So the Green Deal Industrial Plan will focus on this topic. We have our Pact for Skills. We have the European Year for Skills. Just a few figures that show where we really have to get better. We have an impressively low unemployment rate. That's good, 6% roundabout, average in Europe. So the distribution is also different in the different member states, but 6% on average. But if we look at specific groups, we see that youth unemployment is at 14%. What a waste of talent and opportunities. So we have to get better there. If you look at female participation in the labor market, it's 69%. Male participation in the labor market is 80%. So there we can get better also with women accessing the labor market. This has to do with infrastructure and family policies, good schools, good childcare, but we can do something about it. And if you look at the older workers, the older employees, my age group, 60 to 64, only 48% participating in the labor workforce. Here too, what an amount of wisdom that we are not using and experience in our labor market. And the fourth pillar is migration. We have round about 3 million people legally migrating to the European Union, joining the labor market. Important topic. Fourth pillar is trade. we will work on our positive trade agenda. We are working to conclude agreements at the moment being with Mexico, Chile, New Zealand, and Australia. We are making progress with India and Indonesia, and we need to restart a conversation regarding the Mercosur agreement, because we know we need international trade. It establishes supply chains, creates jobs, and helps our industry to develop new products. So this was a long introduction. I stop here. Perhaps one more sentence, the way to go forward. This is the communication now we put forward. Then, of course, we will have the political debate in the European Council on the 9th of February. And in view of the input that we get, we will then shape the legal proposals by mid-March, early enough to discuss that then in the European Council, the regular European Council on the 23rd of March.
Thank you very much. Before we move to your questions, let me just remind you that we will also have a technical briefing later on this afternoon at around 3 p.m. Jorge, you ask for the floor.
Good afternoon. I'm President Jorge Valero with Bloomberg. Question on the sovereignty fund, because I think according to your estimates, the money, the EU funds dedicated or committed to clean investment by 2030, it's around 380 billions already. And this is more or less aligned with what the Biden administration has proposed for his Clean Tech Act. And at the same time, China's investment in clean tech so far it's been committed to around 280 billion euros. I think that's what your document says. So my question is, how much money do you think that this sovereignty fund should have, and whether it should be financed via joint borrowing, or, for example, the EIB or other instruments should play the main role?
I can underline, because all this, what you cited from the communication, against that backdrop, the Sovereignty Fund has the idea that we need for common European projects that are key technology, cutting edge, key technology, common European funding. Also to be sure that these key technologies are spread all across the European Union and have access to the necessary funding. So it looks a bit broader than the focus we have today on the bridging solution and the definition I just gave. It's basically to have a European edge on the critical and emerging technologies. So include mentally topics like microelectronics or the quantum computing or the artificial intelligence, but also biotechnology and, of course, the net zero technology. We need, for these common European projects that are of crucial importance to be a relevant global player, a common European funding. And therefore, it fits well that we have the review of the MFF, but of course we have to speak with the member states about other financing techniques. For me, it's important that we define now, also with our needs assessment, what exactly is it what we are looking at. So what are the needs and what are the topics in the Sovereignty Fund? The principle, I think, is clear. And that we then go to the financing techniques.
David.
Thank you very much. David Carretta, Radio Radicale, Italian Radio. Two questions, if I may. Several member states have said that this approach on state aids could lead to a subsidy race inside the European Union. I'm wondering what would be your answer on that specific point. The second point is on solidarity. The President of the European Council said publicly that there is a need of solidarity to guarantee the level playing field in the internal market. And he mentioned that instrument, common debt instrument like SURE, has a possible solution. That was an idea also of two of your commissioners, Gentiloni and Breton. I'm wondering why you have decided to avoid the issue of solidarity in this communication, and if you would be ready to put forward the proposal on a debt instrument if tasked by the European Council. Thank you.
So if I start with the letter, an amazing, impressive expression, not only of solidarity, but also of trust to the European level, was and is Next Generation EU. It was the very first time that member state trusted the European level to go to the capital market, raise the money with the guarantees of the member states. You know the mechanism. It has never happened before. In the other crises, it was always intergovernmental solutions that were looked at. So Next Generation EU is an outstanding element of solidarity. I'm glad that we have it. And Repower EU is a window of Next Generation EU. Repower EU takes the leftover, not used loans, quite a substantial amount, 225 billion, and makes it possible, enables the member states to flexibilize these loans and to use them targetedly for the net zero industry. The same goes, of course, for many other topics that are in the proposal, how to fund the necessary investment now for the net zero industry. Now, what SURE is concerned, indeed, I've been a strong supporter of SURE in the pandemic because it was a massive threat to the companies, and the lockdowns brought along that companies, because not having any orders anymore, the breakdown of the supply chain, had to lay off their personnel. So it's an excellent instrument that I introduced at that time for the short-time support of labor to keep people in the companies, not to lay them off. At the moment being, we have a different situation. We have not the threat that people are being laid off, but we have the problem that skilled personnel is necessary. So companies are desperately looking for people joining the company, skilled personnel coming to the company. And therefore, I think that's important that we look at the needs at the moment being to focus our programs on that one. What your second question or first question was on state aid. Indeed, Margrethe will be more detailed on that. But I think important is that the state aid, which is the national money that you can then invest, is targeted and that it is temporary. And if we look at what is it targeted, then it's very clearly defined on 6 clean tech areas. This is batteries, it's solar panels, it's wind turbines, heat pumps, electrolyzers, and CCUS, so carbon capture, usage, and storage. Very clearly defined. And these are the critical key industry at the moment being where we have to give an alternative to the offers they get from abroad. We want this industry to stay here and to prosper here. We've listened very carefully to the industry also, what their view on this is. And in general, as I said, we are competitive. We have a relatively high energy environment compared, for example, to the United States. So this doesn't make it easier. But if on top then tax breaks come into play, it's important that we are able also to say we have the matching possibility here, either through state aid or, and this is very important, those member states who cannot take the state aid can apply the same rules like in state aid and tax break like invest the Repower EU money.
Thank you very much. I had Angela Mauro on the chat on Interact, so please switch on your camera and your microphone, Angela.
Yes. Yes. I mean, you can see me. Yes, good morning. Thanks for the opportunity. I insist on the sovereignty fund. Even though I know that you don't have a timeline, you're saying that it takes time, but you're saying also that for the next generation EU, in a few weeks, Europe was capable of elaborating this miracle. In your wish, I mean, as the United States plan is already will be active in March, so as we need this fund, I mean, as soon as we can, what you can, as timeline, what would you imagine the end of the year, by the summer? I know it's very difficult, but if you can give us an idea of when could be the time to have this fund. Thanks.
Yes, I'm sorry if I was not clear enough, or perhaps one point for Next Generation EU. At the beginning, it's very important to keep in mind Next Generation EU. I started to discuss the option. That was shortly before Easter in that year. I think it was 2020 when the pandemic hit. And it took us basically the whole rest of the year to get it up and running. We had this famous council in July, if I recall it correctly, where we spent 3 or 4 days trying to get Next Generation EU and other topics up and running. Until it was approved through all the member states, it was December. And then we started with the plans. So it took us quite a while, although it was for European purposes an amazing step forward. That's Next Generation EU. And describing that, perhaps I was not clear enough. We need indeed now the investment, but we also need a structural answer for the mid and long term. And the investment that is now available is the opportunity to reorient what we've done now today, the Repower EU, by giving guidance, new guidance to Next Generation EU, that you can use this money in the member states now, for example, with tax breaks for the critical companies that you want to keep in your country. So we have this money, and it is around about 250 billion, as I said, immediately available. On top comes possibility of Invest EU and Innovation Fund. This gives us a bridge till we have a structural answer to how are we dealing with key technologies that are of common European interest and where we need a common European funding. And this discussion will go along with the summer, and I cannot give you a precise timeline now.
Yeah.
Hi, Leo Lichterwood for Context. So I had 2 questions. The first one is something that you mentioned in Davos. You said that the Net Zero Industry Act would follow the path of the CHIPS Act that was proposed earlier last year. I'm wondering if your intention or the intention of the Commission is to use the same toolbox that was used for the CHIPS Act for a limited number of key industrial sectors, or if the intention of the Commission was to create a more general framework for European industry that could be used later on in the future, whatever those key industrial sectors might be, and if the list of those key industrial sectors was already defined, or if there was still some studies and impact assessment that needed to be done. And my second question is regarding the speeding up of permitting processes. How do you intend to conciliate the objectives of the industrial imperative, let's say, today, with other Green Deal objectives? And I'm especially thinking of the nature restoration objectives on biodiversity. Is this not contradictory with the permitting processes fast tracking that you were mentioning earlier? Thank you.
So perhaps to take the second question first, you always have to find the balance, that is true. But the definition of go-to areas in the permitting process gives the opportunity to drastically reduce the permitting time. You know that permitting time partially is 6 to 9 years for deployment of renewable energy. And if we look at the balance that you have to find in these go-to areas, we will have, if we're not faster with the deployment of renewable energies, we will not be successful in fighting climate change. And climate change is the biggest threat to any kind of biodiversity, the biggest threat to any kind of nature, of course, also the biggest threat for the human beings. So if you have to look at what is the most effective way to fight climate change, then the deployment of renewable energy, so getting rid of the CO2 emissions and the fossil fuel-based industry processes, then of course the choice is clear that you put a lot of emphasis on the deployment of renewable energy. Within the permitting go-to areas, there are definitions, so it's not you can do whatever you want. There's a clear framework, but I just wanted to explain the logic behind it. Then you were asking on, yes, the definition of the net zero industry. Of course, this will be clearly defined in the Net Zero Industry Act that we will put forward in mid-March, so it's pretty close. And it will be and is accompanied by needs assessment. I think this is very important to keep that in mind, that we have a very clear idea what are the effects on what kind of sectors and where do we have to be present with investment, not to lose these key sectors of the net zero industry, and where is it not necessary. The Sovereignty Fund, I said, is a bit more wider in scope, because here it is about key technologies that we need for the digital and the twin transition.
Yeah.
Janos Bachaman from Euractiv. Thank you very much. I have a question also on the timing of the state aid and the European Sovereignty Fund, because the state aid flexibilization and simplification, you do it now, but the whole solidarity aspect that was mentioned by colleagues before, you say that's for maybe mid-2023, and it's much more vague in the communication. I was wondering, how do you get countries, actors that are mostly interested in the state aid to then still, who now will get their ability to have easier access to state aid, how do you get them to still support also a solidarity aspect like a European Sovereignty Fund?
So perhaps
En cuanto al calendario, de nuevo, mi idea sería, tenemos las reglas estatales renovadas que van a aparecer en breve. Inmediatamente después tenemos el fondo puente y luego tenemos 250.000 millones, tenemos unos 100.000 millones de la política de cohesión que se añade, y esto es un dinero que está disponible ya. Y yo espero, y es muy importante, que los Estados miembros utilicen ese dinero y que inviertan. O sea, que esto se hace paralelamente. Esto es muy importante. Luego, el concepto del Fondo de Soberanía es que necesitamos una respuesta estructural europea sobre cómo tratar y cómo apoyar estas tecnologías clave. Debemos recordar siempre que ningún Estado miembro de la Unión Europea es una isla, ninguno. La integridad del mercado único y el funcionamiento y la prosperidad del mercado único es la razón por la que las industrias están en distintos Estados miembros. Si vemos los típicos Estados miembros con más industria, ellos dependen mucho de suministradores de otros Estados miembros y viceversa. Los Estados miembros que tienen suministradores dependen mucho de que la empresa matriz del Estado miembros más grandes estén allí y que no se vayan, por ejemplo, a Estados Unidos o a otro sitio. Entonces, este principio de cadenas de suministro integradas es nuestro punto fuerte. Esto es lo que nos da prosperidad. Y yo creo que Hay que abstenerse de pensar compartimentos estancos, pensando que los países son islas. No lo son. Toda la economía, el milagro del mercado único es la posibilidad de que tengamos estas cadenas de suministro integradas y que están aumentando todavía cada vez más en la Unión Europea. Por eso, para mí, las ayudas estatales ahora limitadas en el tiempo, la solución puente, que es una cantidad importante, inviértanlo ahora, por favor. Y luego el Fondo de Soberanía es una respuesta estructural de una financiación común europea para tecnologías claves europeas.
Javier Espinosa on the Interactive platform.
Thank you for...
Please put on your camera. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the...
Gracias. ¿Nos puede dar más detalles sobre la financiación Next Generation EU, sobre el tema de las reducciones fiscales? ¿Qué cantidad se va a dedicar a las reducciones fiscales? Más detalles, ¿dónde creen que se van a destinar? Bien, creo que usted se refería a Repower EU, no Next Generation EU, si no me equivoco, ¿eh? Nuestra intención es... ya lo entiendo porque he hablado de Next Generation EU. Hoy damos orientaciones dentro del marco del Fondo de Recuperación y Resiliencia, que va a permitir que Repower EU funcione con modelos de reducciones fiscales. ¿Y por qué lo hacemos así? Pues para actuar rápidamente, para ser predecibles, es decir, que las empresas puedan calcular y para que sea sencillo. Y va a haber un briefing técnico después y si quieren pueden entrar más en detalle. Pero los pasos políticos que hemos dado hoy son la orientación dentro de Next Generation EU y dentro de esto Repower EU. Última pregunta.
Sí, un tema un poquito distinto, si lo permiten, sobre el Brexit, tras los informes del Reino Unido. Sobre el protocolo de Irlanda del Norte, ¿puede darnos una idea de hasta qué punto se está cerca de un acuerdo? Y puede decirnos claramente, ¿está dispuesto a ceder en absoluto sobre el papel del Tribunal de Justicia de la Unión Europea?
As we've said several...
Bueno, hemos dicho varias veces en las últimas semanas y en los últimos meses. Yo tengo una relación excelente y de confianza con el primer ministro. Hemos hablado varias veces también sobre el tema del protocolo. Nuestros equipos están colaborando para encontrar soluciones para que al final se aplique un marco común. El protocolo, como siempre las negociaciones, ya se conoce al principio, todo se negocia al final del todo, cuando ya se sabe cuál es el resultado y se pone la firma final. Lo siento, pero no puedo darle información parcial porque nunca se sabe lo que va a pasar al final del todo y cómo va a ser el paquete al final. Pero repito, se trata de conversaciones muy constructivas. Muchas gracias. Con esto concluimos. Nuestra rueda de prensa va a ir seguida de otra rueda de prensa con Margrethe Vestager, concretamente sobre temas de competencia, temas de ayudas estatales y después habrá un briefing técnico después de esa rueda de prensa.
Bueno, pues ya ha terminado esa rueda de prensa de Ursula von der Leyen, la presidenta de la Comisión Europea, presentando los principales detalles de ese plan, ese Green Deal para contrarrestar los efectos de pues esa ley de reducción de inflación que Estados Unidos ha puesto en marcha y que no gusta nada a Europa porque sería, pues básicamente fastidiar
al viejo continente en términos de competencia en las energías renovables. Hoy lo que ha presentado von der Leyen es una flexibilización de las normas sobre ayudas estatales en la Unión Europea, una reutilización de los fondos existentes, una aprobación más rápida de proyectos ecológicos y también de iniciativas para impulsar habilidades y también sellar acuerdos comerciales para asegurar el suministro de materias primas críticas. Ha dicho también que va a ser en breve, en marzo, cuando Europa también vaya a, también reformar ese mercado eléctrico y también, por otra parte, ha dicho, le ha insistido mucho sobre ese fondo soberano europeo que van a crear también para poder financiar este plan, este Green Deal, pero no ha dicho exactamente cómo se va a financiar ese fondo. Dice que de momento todavía eso sigue bastante pendiente. Y por cierto, les contamos ya el dato que hemos conocido hace un ratito a la 1 de la tarde, es decir, hace 10 minutos, como siempre, como cada miércoles, dato de los tipos hipotecarios en Estados Unidos, de esas hipotecas a 30 años a tipo fijo, esas que son las más populares allí. Seguimos viendo señales desinflacionarias porque seguimos viendo cómo esos tipos de interés firmados en las nuevas hipotecas sigue siendo cada vez más bajo. Es cierto que en este caso en la última semana ese tipo ha sido y ha bajado muy poquito, solo un 0,01% hasta el 6,19% respecto al 6,20% anterior, así que parece que ya estamos empezando a ver cómo parece que se estanca un poco esa bajada en el tipo de interés que se paga en esas nuevas hipotecas a tipo fijo a 30 años, que son, como decimos, las más populares en Estados Unidos. Aún así, resulta curioso, desde luego, ver cómo allí en Estados Unidos hay gente que está pagando, como decimos, un 6,19%, mientras aquí el Euribor, que es lo que se utiliza como tipo de referencia para poner precio a esas hipotecas, está en el entorno del 3,4%, es decir, está casi duplicado en Estados Unidos en esas hipotecas a tipo fijo, pero aún así, poco a poco vemos cómo sigue bajando ese tipo de interés hipotecario en Estados Unidos. Bueno, vamos a cambiar ya de tema. Hablamos de la tensión que cada vez es más importante y crece más entre Estados Unidos y Rusia, pero esta vez tensión nuclear. Ahora los de Biden acusan a los de Putin de violar uno de los mayores pilares que quedaron de la época del final de la Guerra Fría. Hablamos del tratado nuclear New START, que limita las armas nucleares intercontinentales que tienen desplegadas ambas partes. Pues ahora Estados Unidos dice que Rusia no está llevando a cabo las actividades de inspección que debería en su territorio. Según los americanos, esto no permite que Estados Unidos pueda ejercer determinados derechos que se incluyen en el tratado y además amenaza la viabilidad del control de armas nucleares. El tratado limita a 700 los misiles balísticos intercontinentales desplegados, a 1.550 las ojivas nucleares y a 800 los lanzadores de misiles intercontinentales